The auctioneer's voice cut through the cold November air like a blade. Going once. Maya's hand tightened around Daniel's. Her fingers were shaking, not from the cold, but from the weight of what they were about to do. 11 years of savings. The money they'd promised each other would go toward fertility treatments. The fund they'd built dollar by dollar through double shifts and skipped vacations and birthday envelopes stuffed with 20s from her mother who didn't even know what a savings account was. Going twice. She could feel Daniel holding his breath beside her. The crowd around them, mostly developers in expensive coats and local investors with clipboards, didn't even look nervous. They had backup plans. They had portfolios. They had options. Maya and Daniel had one card left to play. The house stood at the end of Alderton Street like something forgotten by time itself. 3 stories of dark wood and crumbling iron lacework. Windows sealed with boards that had warped into the frames. A front door painted a color that used to be burgundy and had since faded into something resembling old blood. No one had entered it in over a century. Not officially. Not legally. The county records listed its last known occupant as deceased in the winter of 1890. Sold, to bidder number 47. Maya exhaled so hard she nearly choked. Number 47. That was them. They had just bought the most dangerous, most mysterious, most mocked decision of their lives, and neither of them had any idea that the house had been waiting for exactly this moment. 6 months before the auction, Maya had been sitting in a hospital parking lot for 45 minutes, unable to go inside. She'd been through 3 failed IVF cycles. The 4th had just ended the same way, a number on a screen, a doctor's apologetic eyes. A pamphlet about alternative paths to parenthood that felt like a polite way of telling her that her body was broken. She was 34 years old. She was a high school art teacher who genuinely loved her students but went home every evening to a silence that felt like accusation. She loved Daniel, God, she loved him, but grief had a way of creating invisible walls even between people who were trying hard to stay close. Daniel was an architectural photographer. He made modest money, enough to survive, but the kind of money that required constant vigilance, tracking every subscription, buying generic brands. Calculating whether they could afford to replace the car's brake pads this month or next. He was good at his work. Genuinely gifted. But the commercial photography market in their mid-sized Pennsylvania city was contracting, and 3 of his biggest clients had moved their budgets to stock photo subscriptions. They lived in a small apartment on the 2nd floor of a building that smelled like someone else's cooking and cigarette smoke from the tenant below. Their neighbors had a baby that cried at 2 a.m. A sound that Daniel had learned to sleep through and Maya had not. The fertility debt sat between them like a third person at every dinner table. $112,000. A number that lived in her chest like a stone. She had started waking up at 4 a.m. with the specific anxiety of someone who had run the numbers too many times and keeps arriving at the same impossible answer. She'd lie there listening to Daniel breathe and wonder if this was it. If this was what their life was going to be, the permanent accumulation of things that didn't work out. She wasn't depressed, exactly. She was depleted. And then Daniel came home one Tuesday evening in May with a printout in his hand and an expression she hadn't seen in years. Not excitement, something quieter. Something more complicated. I found something, he said. She looked up from the papers she was grading at the kitchen table. He spread the printout in front of her. A county auction listing. Property on Alderton Street. Photo taken from the street, a dark Victorian structure, 3 stories, sealed. Condemned adjacent but technically structurally sound according to a county inspector who had apparently accessed the property through a basement window in 2019. Daniel. Just hear me out. That's a haunted house. It's not haunted. It's historic. It's been sealed for 130 years. Which means no one has torn out the original woodwork. No one has painted over the plaster medallions. No one has ripped out the floors and replaced them with laminate. He sat down across from her. And she saw something in his face she recognized, the same look he got when he found an extraordinary photograph. The look of someone who had seen something no one else was looking at carefully enough. Maya, I've been researching it. The architecture alone, if it's intact inside, it could be worth 4-5 times what they're auctioning it for. And if it's not? If there's mold, structural damage, if the foundation is, then we lose everything. He said it plainly. Not recklessly. He said it like someone who had already made peace with a hard truth. But we're already losing everything slowly. The treatments. The debt. This apartment. He paused. Us. She looked at him for a long moment. That word, us, landed differently than he probably intended it to. Not as a threat, but as a diagnosis. She picked up the printout and studied it. Why hasn't anyone else bought it? She asked. Deed restriction. The original owner's estate set a covenant, the property cannot be demolished or subdivided. Has to be purchased as a single-family residence and restored, not flipped into condos. Developers can't touch it. The only people who'd want it are historic preservationists with deep pockets. And apparently there's some legal ambiguity about mineral rights underneath that scared off the big buyers. She stared at the photograph. The house stared back. How much is our savings right now? With what we got back from the insurance partial reimbursement, $83,000. And the opening bid? He hesitated. 75. She set the paper down. She didn't say yes. She didn't say no. She picked up her red grading pen and went back to her student essays. But she kept the printout. They drove out to Alderton Street on a Sunday morning, before they'd told anyone, before they'd committed to anything. Just to look. The neighborhood existed in that particular American state of almost gentrified, almost abandoned, almost historic. A few renovated row homes. A lot of vacant lots. A laundromat that doubled as a community center. The house sat at the very end of the street where the pavement cracked and the sidewalk gave up entirely. Up close, it was extraordinary. Even boarded and weathered, you could see the bones of it. The carved wooden brackets under the eaves. The Witch's Cap Tower on the northeast corner. The front porch with its turned spindles, half-rotted but still present, still arranged in the pattern that some long-dead craftsman had designed with care and intention. The foundation stones were massive, cut granite, set with precision that modern construction rarely bothered with. Daniel was already photographing it before he even got out of the car. Maya walked up to the front door. Someone had painted a county notice on one of the boards, restricted access, County of Harwick. She pressed her palm flat against the weathered wood of the door itself, the original door, and felt something strange. Not supernatural. Not a chill down her spine. Just warmth. The wood, despite the cold November morning, was surprisingly warm to the touch. Like it had been sitting in sunlight, though the porch was entirely shaded. She pulled her hand back. She looked down and noticed something she hadn't expected. At the base of the door frame, carved directly into the wood in letters small enough to miss unless you were looking, 3 words. She crouched down and brushed away a season's worth of leaf debris. Still waiting here. She stared at those words for a long time. Later, she would wonder if she'd imagined them. She hadn't thought to photograph them in that moment. By the time Daniel came over, she was already standing, already turning back toward the car with something decided in her face. Okay, she said. He lowered his camera. Okay, what? We bid. But I need you to promise me something first. Anything. If we win it, we actually do the work. We don't flip it. We don't sell it after 6 months. We restore it, properly. We find out what it was. Who it was. She met his eyes. We treat it like it matters. He didn't ask why. He just nodded. They had no contractor. No renovation experience beyond the YouTube tutorials Daniel had spent 3 weeks consuming. They had no plan B. When Maya's sister Elena found out, after the auction, after the papers were signed, she sat across from them at their kitchen table in that apartment and said very carefully, "I love you both. And I think you've lost your minds." Their friends said similar things with varying degrees of kindness. They moved into the house 3 weeks after closing, because they couldn't afford the apartment rent and the property taxes simultaneously. They moved in with flashlights, a generator, and sleeping bags, because there was no working electricity. They moved in knowing that the interior of the house had been sealed for 133 years. They moved in not knowing what they would find. The first board came off on a Wednesday afternoon in December. Daniel had rented a reciprocating saw. Maya had bought respirator masks from the hardware store. They worked on the front window together, the large parlor window facing the street, removing the outer boards that had been nailed over the original shutters. And when the last board came off, and they unlatched the original shutters, and the winter light fell through glass that had not seen daylight in over a century, the glass was still intact. Wavy, original, antique glass that turned the gray winter light into something almost liquid. Through it, they could see the parlor. It was like looking into a photograph. Not a ruined space. Not a cave of rot and collapse. The wallpaper, a deep teal and gold pattern, was faded and peeling in places, but it was there. A settee sat in the corner covered in a white sheet. A fireplace mantel of carved black walnut dominated the north wall. The plaster ceiling medallion above where a chandelier had hung was intact, every rosette and leaf still defined. Maya started crying before she fully understood why. It wasn't happiness, exactly. It was the sensation of finding something that shouldn't have survived, something that had been forgotten by the world and yet had held itself together in the dark anyway. But the beauty of that first morning was followed by weeks of brutal reality. The kitchen addition, built in the 1880s, was a total loss. The framing had been compromised by a slow roof leak, and when Daniel punched through the plaster to check the structure, the wood crumbled in his hand like wet paper. The entire back section of the house had to come down. That was $11,000 they didn't have, which meant an emergency personal loan at a rate they winced at. The heating system, a later addition from the 1940s, was dead. They ran electric space heaters through the brutal Pennsylvania winter, sleeping in the parlor because it held heat better than anywhere else. Wrapped in sleeping bags on the floor of this museum-quality Victorian room like mismatched artifacts. They argued. Badly. One evening in February, after Daniel had discovered that the cost of rewiring the house to modern code would exceed their remaining budget. He sat down in the middle of the parlor floor and didn't move for a long time. Maya found him there when she came back from the hardware store. Just sitting. Staring at the fireplace. "Say it," he said quietly. "Say what?" That Elena was right. That we were crazy. That this was the worst decision we ever made. She set down her bags. She sat down next to him on the floor. They were both dirty, plaster dust in their hair, paint stripper on their hands. The house groaned around them as the February wind pushed against it. "You know what I keep thinking about," she said. He waited. "I keep thinking about the person who sealed it. Who put those boards up. Someone made a decision, a deliberate, careful decision, to close this house rather than let it be destroyed or changed. They chose to preserve it, even if it meant walking away from it." She looked at the ceiling, at the medallion, at the faded wallpaper. "That takes a strange kind of faith, doesn't it? To believe that someone would come along eventually who would understand what you were protecting." Daniel was quiet for a moment. "That's either very profound or very convenient thinking. Probably both." They laughed. First time in weeks. It broke something loose. They got through February. March was harder. Maya's school district didn't renew several arts positions due to budget cuts, and while her job was ultimately preserved, the uncertainty added another layer of anxiety to an already fragile existence. Daniel landed a commercial photography contract for a real estate agency, which was below his skill level but above nothing. They learned to do things they'd never done. Maya learned to strip and refinish hardwood floors, watching the same tutorial 17 times, practicing on a piece of scrap oak before touching the original pine floors of the dining room. Daniel learned basic electrical work, enough to handle the cosmetic elements while they saved for the licensed electrician for the panel and the technical work. They started documenting everything. Daniel photographed every stage, before and after, the hidden details revealed during demolition, the textures of a house slowly coming back to life. He posted some images online, mostly as a personal record. He didn't expect anyone to notice. The turning point didn't arrive dramatically. It arrived in an attic, on a Tuesday in April, during a thunderstorm. Maya had been clearing out the attic, the last room they'd accessed, reached through a small door on the third-floor landing. It was hot even in spring, airless and close, filled with the accumulated silence of generations. Trunks. Crates. A dress form standing in the corner like a headless ghost. She'd been working up there for 2 hours when the storm broke outside and the rain drummed against the roof with sudden intensity. She sat down on a trunk to wait it out. The trunk she'd sat on was not fully closed. The latch had broken at some point, recently, because the wood around it looked freshly stressed, as though something inside had settled or shifted. She lifted the lid. Inside, preserved in the dry attic air with extraordinary care, were papers. Journals. Correspondence. Architectural drawings. A leather-bound ledger. And beneath all of it, wrapped in oilcloth, a set of documents that took her breath away. The house had not been sealed by a stranger. The documents told a story she had to piece together over several evenings, reading by lamplight, cross-referencing with county records Daniel pulled at the library. The story went like this. The house had been built in 1873 by a woman named Harriet Voss, a widow who had inherited money from her father's estate in a period when women rarely controlled property. She had commissioned the house herself, had, in fact, worked directly with a local carpenter to design it. And the surviving correspondence showed a woman of extraordinary intelligence and aesthetic vision who knew exactly what she wanted and why. Harriet had lived in the house until 1890, when she became gravely ill. She had no children. Her closest companion was a younger woman named Cecilia, who appears throughout the journals in ways that the formal language of the era both obscured and preserved, a love story written in the space between words. Facing death, and facing a society that would have scattered and sold everything she'd built, Harriet had made a decision. She'd left the house to a historical preservation trust she'd established herself, funded by the last of her estate, with a single condition. The house could only be sold to a buyer who agreed to restore it, not to profit from it. She'd then had Cecilia seal it. Every window boarded. Every door latched from inside through the back service entry, which Cecilia would exit last. There was a final letter in the trunk, written in Harriet's hand but clearly dictated from illness. The handwriting was too perfect, too controlled for a dying woman. If you have found this, then someone came who deserved to find it. The house knows. I believe that houses know, the way old trees know which direction the light is coming from. I hope you have understood what I built here, not just wood and glass and plaster, but the idea that beauty is worth preserving even when the world outside has forgotten its value. I hope you are not afraid of what something costs when it matters. Maya sat in the rain-loud attic for a long time with that letter in her hands. Then she went downstairs and showed Daniel. He read it twice. Set it down on the parlor floor carefully, as though it might dissolve. Looked at her. She waited for us, Maya said quietly. Not literally. Not as a mystical statement, but as the only sentence that felt true in that moment. "Yeah," Daniel said. He picked up his camera. And then he posted the photographs, the letter, the journals, the architectural drawings, Harriet's correspondence, with a full account of what they'd found and who Harriet Voss was. A woman almost entirely absent from the historical record. A woman who had built something extraordinary and spent her last resources ensuring it would survive. The post went viral within 48 hours. The attention was not entirely comfortable. Journalists called. A documentary production company reached out within a week. The County Historical Society, which had known nothing about Harriet Voss, descended in a kind of institutional excitement that felt simultaneously wonderful and invasive. A professor of Victorian women's history at the University of Pittsburgh contacted Daniel through Instagram and asked if she could access the documents for research. Maya and Daniel sat together and made decisions carefully. They granted access to the documents to the professor and the Historical Society. They talked to journalists selectively, choosing the ones who seemed interested in Harriet's story rather than the "crazy couple bought a haunted house" angle. They declined the documentary, not because the offer wasn't generous, but because they wanted the restoration to be finished on their terms, in their time. Without cameras following them through every setback. The attention, though, brought something practically useful: visibility. A retired master carpenter in his late 60s named Frank Orozco saw Daniel's photographs and sent a message offering to help with the restoration work at cost. He'd spent his career doing high-end historic preservation before retiring and was, as he put it, dying of boredom in a way that's going to kill me before the boredom does. He showed up the following weekend in a truck loaded with specialized hand tools and an opinion about everything. He was insufferable and extraordinary. He could look at a piece of original trim and tell you what wood it was, what mill it had come from, how it had been shaped, and what modern equivalent came closest. He showed Maya how to match the original paint colors by analyzing the layers in cross-section. He showed Daniel how the house's original ventilation system worked, a passive design built into the walls that was, in several respects, more sophisticated than what most houses use today. The work began to move. But it wasn't the help, external as it was, that fundamentally changed things. It was what the work had done to them. Maya noticed it first in herself. The way she approached problems had shifted. Before, in the years of fertility treatments, of running headlong into obstacles and crumbling every time, she had experienced failure as a verdict. As information about her fundamental worth. Now she experienced failure as a phase. She'd stripped a section of floor wrong and had to redo it twice. She'd matched a paint color badly and had to repaint an entire hallway. She'd cried once, briefly, and then picked up the brush and gone back. She was sleeping through the night. That felt significant in a way she couldn't fully articulate. The 4 a.m. anxiety, the stone in the chest, had not entirely gone, but it had changed texture. It was no longer the weight of everything she didn't have. It was the weight of everything she was doing, which was an entirely different kind of heaviness. Daniel, meanwhile, had quietly had the most creatively significant period of his career. The photographs he was making inside the house, of Harriet's journals illuminated by afternoon light through wavy original glass, of restoration in progress, of details that no one had seen in over a century, were extraordinary. The real estate agency contract felt very far away. He was approached by a gallery in Philadelphia. He almost said no. Old habit, the habit of believing that the thing you made in an unguarded, authentic moment was somehow less legitimate than the thing you made for someone who was paying you. Maya pushed back on that. "You're doing the thing you're actually good at," she said. "Stop apologizing for it." He said yes to the gallery. They also had a conversation, quieter and harder than either of them expected, about the fertility treatments. About whether they wanted to continue. About what they actually wanted their future to look like, as opposed to what they'd assumed it was supposed to look like. That conversation took 3 separate evenings. It involved tears and honesty that felt raw and necessary. They didn't arrive at a clean resolution. They arrived at a different question, not when do we try again but who are we, and what kind of life are we building, and realized that the house, in forcing them to rebuild something together, had rebuilt something between them that they hadn't known was damaged. The professor from Pittsburgh, Dr. Anita Solano, came to see the house in October, almost exactly 1 year after the auction. She'd spent 10 months with the documents. She had verified and contextualized and discovered. She arrived with a colleague and a folder of research, and over a dinner Maya cooked in the now-restored kitchen, she told them what she'd found. Harriet Voss, it turned out, was moderately documented in county financial records but entirely absent from social histories, invisible in the way that women without prominent husbands were often rendered invisible. But she was not as solitary as the sealed house had suggested. She had been, Dr. Solano explained carefully, part of a small network. A group of women in western Pennsylvania in the 1870s and 80s who quietly pooled resources, legal, financial, and social, to protect each other's property and autonomy in a period when law offered them very little. They wrote to each other in a cipher embedded in apparently mundane correspondence. They held property in each other's names. They preserved each other's assets against predatory relatives, hostile legal systems, and the 1,000 ordinary mechanisms by which women's work was erased. Harriet's house was not just a home. It had been, at various points, a meeting place, a safe house, a record vault. The ledger you found, Dr. Solano said, leaning forward over the dinner table. We've been able to cross-reference it. It's not just a household account book. It's a record of the network's financial transactions going back 15 years. She paused. If we're right, and we're fairly sure we are, Harriet Voss wasn't just preserving her own legacy. She was preserving evidence. Evidence that these women existed, that their network existed, that what they built together was real. The sealed house had been an archive. Maya sat with that for a long moment. She knew someone would come, she finally said. She built it so that someone would be able to understand it when they did, Dr. Solano said. She designed the covenant specifically to require restoration, not just to protect the architecture, but to ensure that whoever entered would spend enough time, go deep enough into the structure, to find what was hidden in it. The words carved at the base of the door frame came back to Maya with sudden force. Still waiting here. Not the house waiting. Harriet, waiting, not as a ghost, not as a fantasy, but as a mind that had thought forward across a century and placed something where the right hands would eventually find it. She had bet on the future. She had bet that someone would care enough to look. Daniel reached across the table and took Maya's hand. She didn't look at him. She was looking at the dining room wall, at the teal and gold wallpaper they'd painstakingly restored, that they'd matched exactly to the original using the surviving sections as reference. Under that wallpaper, in one section of the parlor, they had found 6 names written directly on the plaster in pencil. Women's names, with dates beside them going back to 1874. She had thought they were previous residents or guests. She now understood they were something closer to signatures. Something closer to "we were here." She thought about her art students. About the ones who worked in the margins of their notebooks when they thought she wasn't watching. About the ones who created things that no one saw and might never see. She thought about the specific courage required to make something carefully, and then to let it go, and to trust, without evidence, without guarantee, that time would eventually deliver it to someone who understood its value. The house was not finished by the end of that first year. It would take another 18 months to complete the restoration fully. Franco Roscoe worked until his knees wouldn't let him, and then sat in a restored chair in the parlor and directed while Maya and Daniel worked. The gallery show happened in February. The photographs sold. Dr. Solano's research resulted in a journal article, and then a book, and Harriet Voss's name entered the historical record with the weight it deserved. Maya and Daniel did not have biological children. That door had closed. But they opened the house, once it was fully restored, to a historical education program for local high school students. Art students, history students, students who learned to look at old things and see the evidence of the minds that made them. Maya would watch them sometimes, moving through the rooms that she and Daniel had brought back from silence, and feel something she didn't have a precise word for. Not satisfaction, exactly. Not pride. Something more like continuity. The sense that she had become part of a chain of preservation, that she had received something and was passing it forward. The last thing Daniel did, when the restoration was complete, was photograph the base of the original front door. The 3 words carved into the wood. Still waiting here. He printed it large and hung it in the entryway. Because that was the real lesson, not the architecture, not the history, not the investment that had ultimately returned more than they'd spent. Not even the love story they'd accidentally restored alongside the house. The real lesson was about the nature of waiting. Harriet Voss had not sealed that house in despair. She had sealed it in extraordinary confidence, confidence that the future was not indifferent, that beauty was not permanent only if someone protected it. That there would come a day when 2 people running out of options would look at a boarded-up door and see something worth everything they had. And the thing she'd believed, the wild, unverifiable, completely irrational thing, had turned out to be true. Maya stands at the parlor window now, in late afternoon light that comes through 150-year-old glass and falls across restored floors in patterns that shift with the seasons. She is not a different person from the woman who sat in a hospital parking lot unable to go inside. She carries that woman with her. But she has learned something that woman hadn't known yet. That the things you build in faith, impractical, expensive, painful, against all advice, have a way of finding the people they were meant for. That sometimes the most rational thing you can do is bet on the future. That there are houses that wait. And so here is the question I want to leave you with, not about Victorian architecture, not about real estate, not about renovation costs or historical preservation. What have you been keeping sealed? What have you closed up and boarded over because the world told you it wasn't practical, and is it possible that the right moment to open it has been waiting for you all along? The house on Alderton Street still stands. The wavy glass in the parlor window still turns ordinary light into something almost liquid. And carved into the wood at the base of the original front door, if you bend down and look closely enough, are 3 words that have survived a century and a half of waiting. Still waiting here.